Well, hello. I hope your little stitched fishes are coming along nicely. I've been working on my hexagon here, and today I'd like to show you some of the things that I did to embellish the fish that I have. But first of all, I want to answer a question that I had from one of you, which I'm paraphrasing here, I have to admit, but it was something along the lines of my fish have nowhere to hide. Are we going to be adding any plants to our scrolls? And the quick answer to that is yes, absolutely. This month we're focusing on fish, but later on we'll be adding all kinds of things, coral and plants and seashells, all kinds of things. But you can absolutely start adding whatever you like to your scrolls at any time that you like. If you have a good idea, go with it. And I pulled out a couple of things here that I could possibly use as water plants. Just the same way that we were cutting out our fish shapes from pieces of cloth, you could easily cut out plant shapes. I'm just going to cut out a really long, skinny plant shape out of this fun fabric here that I have. And I actually end up getting two for one because I can cut out the leftover bit there and it makes another nice plant. I can put those wherever I like and yeah, start adding to your scroll whatever moves you. Now let's get on with embellishing our fish, shall we? And the first thing I want to do is to look at how we can add some fins and tails to our fish. Now, one of my little goldfish, I added a 3D fin on the side of my fish with another piece of fabric. So you don't have to stay flat. You can have things sticking out. So this was really fun. Instead of using the same color cloth, I'm going to use one that's slightly different color so that the fin will show up. I feel like if I use the same cloth, it might not be obvious that there was an extra fin there. So I'm cutting out a rough kind of a teardrop shape. It's rounded at one end and pointy at the other end. And the rounded end is the end that I'm going to sew onto the base fabric. So I'm going through all the layers there and I'm going to attach this little bit on this little fin right on there just with some straight stitches, several of them well into the fabric. If you try to stitch too close to the edge, your fabric will end up fraying and it won't be secure. So make sure you stitch well into that little fin. But I am going to go all the way around this little fin to secure it so that the threads don't fray, but I found it was easier to stitch once it was attached to the larger piece of fabric than trying to hold on to that teeny little fin and sew it. And here I'm fumbling around. I got a bit of a knot there. And I sped that part up so you didn't have to watch me fumbling around in real time. So I'm using blanket stitch to go around all the way around the edge, making sure I take that stitch well into the fabric. I'm only going through the top layer of cloth. I'm not going all the way through the background cloth or the body of the fish. I'm just stitching through the top layer of cloth there, and I'm making sure I take one stitch right at the end near that skinny end, again well into the fabric. If you get too close to the edge, the threads will just start to tear out. Yeah, I'm going to go all the way around back to the beginning. Now, if your piece of cloth is fairly stable and you're not finding that the threads are coming out, you may not want to stitch all the way around, but I think that people are going to want to play with that little fin. I know I do, so I'm going to make sure it's very secured there. Now I'm going to make the top fin, and I'm just going to make this with embroidery stitches, and I'm using again the blanket stitch, long narrow blanket stitches. So the first one is actually more like a long fly stitch, but then I'm going to continue on with more blanket stitches that are really quite close together. They're going to get shorter as I go along, so it kind of creates a triangular shape. And the way that I've done it, you can actually see the background through them, but I'm not going to worry about that. They look a little bit transparent. It can look like a shadow. I can fill that in with more stitches if I like. And if you look at the other fish that I did, it's kind of a slightly different shape. The highest point is kind of in the middle of the shape, and this one, it starts at the first end. So you can do whatever creative shape you like. and I'll just finish this off. The last stitches are really short and sort of blend that fin into the body there. And then I'm going to move to the bottom and do two little fins. I'm not really great with fish anatomy. If you want something more specific, you could certainly look at a reference photo, but I'm going to do two small fins at the bottom using chain stitch. I'm going to angle them slightly towards the back. And that first one, I didn't think it was prominent enough, so I'm going over top rather than taking it out. I'm just going to go over top and add more, and that's sort of really my philosophy in developing my pieces. If there's something that I don't like, I don't take it out. I think about how can I add to that to make it into something that's more interesting. And now what I'm doing is I'm adding some lines on the tail. They're kind of like an arrow. They're radiating out from that central point and spreading out towards the edges of the tail there. And again, this is something that you can look at a reference photo of a fish and you'll see that kind of shape on the fish. Although my fish is orange, I've chosen a pink thread so that the stitches show up a bit. If I wanted them to be kind of invisible and hidden, I would have chosen something that was closer in tone to the base fabric, but I really want these stitches to be noticeable, so I've chosen a different color. Not a drastically different color, but a slightly different color. Now, I have to say that I had a hard time deciding how to present this video because I, in fact, did not work on one fish at a time to completion and then go to another fish and then to another fish. I bounced back and forth through the whole project. I did a little bit of work on this fish, then I went to work on another fish, then I came back to this fish, but because your fish are different from mine, I thought it would be really confusing if I showed you the video that way. So I've cut it so that I show you all the work that I do on one fish, then all the work on the next fish. So what I'm doing here now is, after working elsewhere on my piece with some yellow thread, I'm coming back here and adding some more stitching onto this fish with what's left of the yellow thread after I was finished using it elsewhere. And then that's adding even more dimension and depth to this fish here. And now let me show you one of the other fish, the other gullfish that I worked on. And I did this one in a slightly different manner. In this one, I actually added some stitches to resemble fish scales. And the stitch that I used was a feather stitch, which is, if you remember from before, it's similar to a fly stitch, but it's kind of continuous. And don't you think those look a little bit like fish scales? So, and I'm not sure why I did this, but I decided to do the feather stitch in the reverse order. Instead of starting with that sort of U shape, I'm starting with the securing stitch near the tail of my little fish there. And then I'm going to create that U by coming up in front of the securing stitch, the anchoring stitch, then going through it and then back into my threads. So I don't know why I decided to do it this way. You don't have to at all. And now the next stitch, when I'm working in this direction, the next stitch, I can use the legs off my previous fly stitch to go to secure the next stitch. And then I keep working up there, just adding more of those loops using the previous legs. I'll turn the fabric as I need to make it easier for me to work with, and I'll just work my way up to the front of the fish. Now I'm not going to cover the whole fish with this feather stitch, although you certainly could. I'm just going to have it along from about the middle up to the top edge of the fish, and I'm not going to go all the way to the front. I'm going to go up to just about where the eye would show up. So I'm going to leave the bottom and the area where the eye is plain for now, and I might add some other stitching in later on, but for now I'm just going to do this feather stitch in reverse. So now the next thing I want to show you is, on top of the feather stitch, I added some French knots. So the way the French knot works is you come up on top of your fabric, you wrap your thread around your needle, and then you go back into the fabric in about the same spot that you came up, and then you pull really slowly. Now this takes a lot of practice, and I'm going to use the stitch for the fish eyes, so practicing in a place where it's not going to be too noticeable is a good idea. I'll do it once more just so you can see what happens. It's quite easy to end up with a loop in your cloth instead of having just that plain knot. And sometimes if you're very careful, you can work that loop out. Like here, I've can't pull the thread anymore and I've got a loop still on the front, so I'm being very gently trying to work it out, but sometimes that doesn't work. So what happens then is that you could either take it out completely, or you can just leave it as it is and put some more stitches on there so that loop is secure. But if you're putting the stitch in a place where it's going to be really prominent, you don't want to have to deal with the loop. But here what I'm doing is I'm adding these little dots, so splotches on top of the fly stitches, which just adds more dimension. For some reason I decided I didn't like it. It wasn't looking scale like, it was looking like there was some coral sitting on top of my fish. Hint, hint, this is one of the things that we're going to do next month when we look at coral. We're going to use these fly stitches and feather stitches to create coral, amongst other things. But like I said, this would be a really great place for you to practice your French knots, and something like this where there's a whole mass of them, so it won't be so obvious if one of them doesn't look perfect. And sometimes I wrap the thread around twice, and sometimes I wrap it around once. You can practice and see what happens. You could even wrap it around 3 times. The more times you wrap the thread, the bigger your knots are going to be. And after I finish with my French knots, I've already put some pink threads on the tail there, some lines with the pink thread, and now I'm going in with the same beige thread that I used for my French knots and adding more lines there. And now with the yellow thread, and I think that was the yellow thread that I used on the tail of the other goldfish, I'm creating a fin on this side. So this is a flat fin, it's not a 3D fin like the other one. And just the way that I did the upper fin, I'm using blanket stitch, several long narrow blanket stitches to create that fin there. And I'll do the same at the top and the bottom on this fish as well, just like I did on the other goldfish, using chain stitch at the bottom there for the 2 fins at the bottom in yellow, and at the top I'll use again the blanket stitch. And I think that as you can see that as you start adding these embroidery stitches to your fish, they become more fish-like and less like just small pieces of cloth sewn onto the background. They start to really take on personality and become rather fish-like. So those are those 2. Now, fish hatching. I could not resist a pun. So in the art world, when you're drawing, if you draw sort of short, straight lines close together, it's called hatching, and they create shadows or darker areas on your drawing. So I'm using that same technique, but with thread, to create a darker area along the top of my green fish here. So I'm just going back and forth with running stitch, and I'm trying not to line things up so that each row of stitches sort of is staggered from the previous row, but not evenly staggered, so they're quite uneven. So they're just rows of dashes that darken up this top layer of the fish. Because we're using stitch rather than a pencil, we also have the ability to create lighter areas. If I had done this hatching like this, these rows of lines using a lighter color on a dark color piece of cloth, then I would be making a lighter area. So you can play around with this as well. And I will show you again my hexagon with the different fish, and I use this sort of hatching as well, overlapped with French knots to create a rather fish-like pattern on some of the fish. So again, you can look at reference photos of different fishes and you'll often see stripes and dots on them. And I'm using the same darker gray thread here for my tail to do the lines on my tail of this fish. I have I have this one full green fish, and I have two partial green fish, and I'm going to give them all the same treatment. And the other thing that putting these lines in, it also, this green fabric had very definitive puppy paw prints on it, and it starts to disguise those. You can still see them, but they start to look more like blotches than paw prints. Now I'm going to work on the fish eyes. So if you practice up on your French knots, then you can start using those for eyes. And I did do all of the eyes at the same time using the same thread. And I picked the darkest shade that I had, and I think this one's actually a really dark green, or it might be a black, but I often don't use black as a thread because it's a really harsh color, and I just try to use a really, really dark version of another color like green or blue or brown. So each of my fish is getting a French knot eye, and you can see that this would be really obvious if your French knot didn't work out. If you weren't happy with it, I would say that this is a time when it would be quite all right to cut it out and try again. And now I have two very special fish that I'm going to kind of work through quite a bit for you. One is this puffer fish. First of all, I've added a few spikes here, but now what I'm doing is I'm adding two fins, one on each side. So this fish, we're kind of looking down on it rather than looking at the side of it. But I'm adding the fins exactly the same way using the blanket stitch, long narrow blanket stitches, and I'm adding one on each side of this fish right now instead of just one at the top. I'm also going to add all kinds of spikes. Now, for the spikes for this fish, I mainly used a single strand of floss because I didn't want it to be really heavy. I wanted it to be quite thin and spike-like. So here I am, and I've gone in with various colors. I haven't used just one color, but various shades from yellow to beige to white to even kind of a darkish brown. I've worked all over the fish fairly randomly, but mainly having all of the spikes sort of pointing from the center towards the outside, but I did not leave a hole at the center. I crossed them over, and I just kept going, adding different colors until I felt like it had enough spikes. And then this other fish, this one is probably the most work. I created an angelfish out of that square or diamond of cloth that I put on, and this one took the longest time because of course I'd left the tail and the fins for me to fill in with embroidery stitches, and while I was doing this I really got a sense of how much time it takes to fill in areas just with the thread, and I really appreciated how much help the pieces of cloth gave me in doing this. So what I did first, I took a pink thread and I'm outlining that long upper fin that the angelfish has, and so I'm using what's called a stem stitch. The way this stitch works is that you take one regular running stitch, and then instead of taking your next running stitch forward, you actually go back halfway along your previous stitch and then go forward and then back and forward, and you keep going. So what I'm doing is I'm creating this sort of long curved fin at the top there, the outline of it, and then I'll go back in later and fill that in with more stitches. Now when I'm doing this sort of stitch, I find it easiest to come up on the inside of the curve. If I come up on the other side, I find that the line kind of gets a little bit lost. So you can play around with which side you come up with and see what works for you. And I'm making quite an elaborately shaped tail, sort of a really wavy, swishy tail. And unfortunately, the rest of the video showing you how I added the tail and started filling in the area kind of didn't work. So after I'd outlined all of those areas, what I did was I went in with different colors again that sort of coordinate with the color fish, and not just one color. I've used white and off-white and yellow and a little bit of gray, and with a combination of stem stitch and just straight stitches, I've just sort of filling in those areas. And again, you'll notice that you'll see the outside showing through in some areas. I'm not worried about it. And the stripes on this fish were also created using stem stitch. And here what I'm doing is I'm creating sort of a mottled yellow stripe using feather stitch. Just thought I'd try it out and see what it does. And like I said, this fish took me the longest time. I spent a lot of time working on it, and that's because there were lots of areas that I had to fill in. That large fin at the top, the tail, and some long tenderly type fins at the bottom. And I it took me a long time to really kind of sink into this. I felt like a bit like I was battling with that really intense orange and yellow background that this fish is sitting on. And I thought, well, maybe that was not the best placement for this fish. So I did lots of things. I tried working with the fish, adding a dark outline around the fish with a dark gray, and it still wasn't really making me happy. But I kept working on it. Instead of tearing it out and changing it, I just kept working on it. It's not totally finished yet. I still want to do more work on it, but by the end, I think I got there. But for now, I'm just kind of working around the fish in different colors. So I'm adding some stitching here to make it look less like just a piece of cloth and a little bit more decorative. I'm just adding some straight stitches there. And here, this is where I thought the fish is not really standing out, and I'm not enjoying that really bright background. So what I thought I would do is I thought I would de-emphasize the background. And I'm just taking some straight stitches with some, I think this is actually black thread, and I'm not going to completely cover up the bright colored background, but I'm going to darken it so that my light colored fish is more likely to show up there. And just straight stitches in, out, and they're crossing over each other. This is hatching and cross hatching. If you're in the drawing world, in the art world, if you cross your hatch lines, then it's called cross hatching. And there you can see now my fish is really starting to show up. And I think I'm going to leave this video here, but hopefully you've got some ideas on embellishing your fish. I'm going to leave you here with one last look at my hexagon, and you can see the different ways that I've worked on these fish. And I hope that gives you some more ideas to work on your fish. If you've got any questions, if there's anything that you're curious about or is puzzling you, let me know in the comments below. I think you can also send me messages through Ko-fi, and I'll see if I can answer them for you. I will see you again soon.